Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on Tokyo College webinar. My name is Wang Wenlu, project researcher at Tokyo College. Unfortunately, Professor Hoshi cannot join us today, so I'll be the one to moderate the event today. It is my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Professor Jenny CORBETT. Professor CORBETT is currently a Tokyo College professor here at University of Tokyo and an Emeritus professor of the Australian National University. She has taught and researched on Japan's economic performance and policy, on monetary policy, and on East Asian financial integration at universities in the UK, Australia, and Japan for 40 years. Professor CORBETT has been working closely with Tokyo College since its establishment in 2019. She had previously visited Tokyo College for a few times and had already given a few great lectures to our audience. Today, Professor CORBETT will be giving us a talk entitled, "Do Japanese Companies Hoard Too Much Cash?" The lecture will be followed by comments from Professor Makoto Nilei. Professor Nilei is professor at the Graduate School of Economics here at UTokyo. His research fields include macroeconomics, business cycles, financial fluctuations, income inequality, and complex systems. At the end of the event, questions from the audience will be addressed. So if you have any questions you'd like to ask, please use the Q&A functions to submit your question at any time during the lecture. Let me also remind you that there is a language button at the bottom of the screen. So if you would like to listen to this lecture in Japanese, please click on Japanese for the live English to Japanese interpretation. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Professor CORBETT. Professor CORBETT, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much indeed. Let me first thank Tokyo College for giving me this great opportunity to be here as a visitor and giving me the space and resources to do research on all kinds of interesting topics and to listen to the research by other visitors here. And I'd also like to thank the staff who've put this video lecture together. It takes a huge amount of effort and they are always marvelously efficient and reliable. So with that, I'd like to start the topic for today. Do Japanese companies hoard too much cash? And those of you who've heard me speak before will know that I normally talk about fairly general topics, not things that are technical. Today's talk is a little bit more in the economics vein, and so I hope that you'll find it interesting enough and that I'll make it clear enough. But please put questions to us if you have anything that you wish to have explained more clearly. Now, I'd like to start sharing my screen, and we'll see if there. Now, can you see the, yes? Okay, good, great. So today's topic about hoarding cash is something that has been in, now let me just see, here we go, has been in the press on and off for quite a long time. And in fact, I've highlighted here some headlines from the international press, but of course there are many more from the Japanese press. And as you can see from these headlines, they go back at least as far as 2014. But in fact, there's quite a lot of press coverage going back even further than that. What's noticeable about these headlines is that on the whole, they designate this issue as a problem for Japan. That is, companies hoarding cash is seen to be some kind of a problem, with the exception of the headlines during the COVID period, when there was a moment at which the journalists and others stopped to reflect that perhaps there were some advantages for Japanese companies who were cash rich and who were able then to withstand the impact of the COVID crisis when they had no income coming in. So clearly there are different views about this, but on the whole, the voices are mostly critical. What I'd like to do in the talk is to unpack the headlines. The headline is, do companies hoard too much cash? But in fact, I apologize in advance. I'm going to take you on a rather long, circuitous route to get to thinking about that question, because to my mind, there are two important steps to go through to make sense of this debate. One is to ask the question whether Japanese companies save too much, and that's not the same thing as holding too much cash. And then the second question is to ask, what do they do with those savings? Because there are several options open to companies, only one of which is hoarding cash. And the distinction between these two is not always clear in the commentary, and I think it's quite important, if we're going to understand this, to take some time to look at it carefully. This problem is not unique to Japan, and so some of those headlines I showed you earlier had mention of other countries, but in fact there's a lot of work that does not only compares Japan with other places, but simply points out that many countries have something of a puzzle about corporate savings. China was singled out a long time back. In 2010, there was a paper about that. The OECD devoted a whole chapter to corporate savings in its Economic Outlook of 2007. And in fact, the real concern about this began when Ben Bernanke, then governor of the Federal Reserve, gave a lecture in 2005 and coined the term the global saving glut. So let's take a look at Japan's savings situation. Japan, you probably think of Japan as a high savings country. We did for a very long time always designate Japan that way. That is not as clear as it used to be. In total domestic gross savings, Japan still ranks reasonably high by global standards. I'll just go forward and show you this chart, and you can see here that Japan's gross domestic savings here are higher than the average for high-income countries, but considerably lower than the rest of East Asia. So Japan, and have come down since the beginning of this chart, which is 1996. So it is the case that private sector savings are still reasonably high. It's worth remembering that private sector savings are higher than the total because the government sector is negative. We'll come back to that. But the key point is that within private sector savings, household savings are not the main source of domestic saving for Japan any longer. The main source is now corporate savings, and that is a significant change since the 1990s when and the burst of Japan's bubble. And you can see that in this chart where we have stacked bars here showing corporate savings in the dark blue, household savings in the light blue, and government savings in the pink. And you can see that over the period from the middle of the 90s, corporate savings have come to represent a much bigger part of gross domestic savings, and household savings have shrunk. So that tells us something unusual about Japan, which is that the total private sector savings are not behaving the way we expected to see for Japan. We expect aging countries to have falling savings. We expect older populations to use up the savings they've accumulated during their lifetime for their consumption and after they've stopped working and stopped earning income. In aggregate, Japan's private sector savings are not following that pattern because of the offset that's coming from corporate savings increases that are offsetting the falls in household savings. Now, at the moment, that's giving Japan still quite large gross domestic savings. That could change, and whether that matters or not, we'll come back to at a later point. Now, as I've said, this is not unique to Japan. There is a literature and a discourse about the global corporate savings boom, that savings glut that Ben Bernanke referred to. And the data show this quite clearly, that globally corporate savings have been rising as a percent of GDP since the 1980s, and at the same time, household savings have been declining as a percent. So this is the global picture, and you can see that corporate savings here since the 1980s have been rising. Household savings have been declining, so that we have a net, this is, I beg your pardon, government savings down here, which have not changed very much, and then periodically, so for example, global financial crisis saw a big decline as governments spent large fiscal stimulus. If we carry this forward to the COVID period, you'd see a similar dip in government savings. But the point is that globally, we have a really significant change in who are the savers in our economies across the world. But it is the case that the rate of increase of Japan's corporate savings has been higher than the increase in other countries. That is, the rate of increase in the corporate sector savings share has been higher. And with the result that Japan's structure of savings now looks a bit different to some of its peers. And this shows you Japan compared to Germany, the US, and the UK. Japan here has corporate savings in the light blue and private household savings in pink. And you can see that compared to Germany, the US, the UK, the corporate sector is accounting for a much higher share in Japan than it is in a number of other countries. Now, I want to stop here and explain to you what we mean by corporate savings. And bear with me, this is a rather tedious looking accounting kind of slide, but it's a helpful sort of structure to have in our minds as we go through. The way in which we calculate corporate savings goes in stages. Companies generate value added. That is the value of their output minus the inputs that they consume in the production process, gives us value added. Out of that, they pay employees. Composition of employees comes out of that. And they pay taxes, direct taxes on production, that is value added taxes. That gives us gross operating surplus, which is sometimes called operating profits. Out of that, we can deduct net interest paid, property income received, net other current transfers, a small amount, direct taxes paid. This is corporate tax paid to governments, and dividends paid to shareholders. So each of these stages generates a different definition of profits. But the key point for today's lecture is that gross saving is what is left after we take all of those elements out of the gross operating surplus. So when we talk about gross savings, we're not talking about profits. We are talking about what is left after the payments to various factors of production and taxes to government. And I'm going to talk later about net lending, which is, again, a next step down. Now, let's have a look at what the data say about corporate savings and what are the main reasons for the rise that we see globally in corporate savings. Essentially, the literature finds that the main cause of the rise in savings is a rise in operating profits. So it comes from that first stage of the calculation. Operating profits have risen across the globe up to the global financial crisis. Now, what that means is that the labor share out of value added was falling. And indeed, there's a big literature about concerns around the decline in the labor share. Then when we go down to the next stage to look at savings, the observation is that at least up until the global financial crisis, there wasn't that much change in interest payments or dividends or direct corporate taxes. We'll come back to that. There's some dispute. But the result is that the share of retained profit of savings out of the operating profit didn't change very much. So globally, what we saw was a rise in operating profits and savings rising in lockstep with that. So that gave us savings rising as a share of corporate value added and as a share of GDP was coming from the rise in profits. Since the global financial crisis, that seems to have changed. It looks as if the labor share has stopped falling, but the share of corporate savings down at the bottom of our flow chart is still rising. So something different is going on here now, and we probably need more research. A lot of the research that I've been able to find was done in around 2018, so it was before COVID, and the data is a bit out of date. A couple of other studies, broadly though, support that set of observations that rising savings comes mainly from rising operating profits, but some of the other researchers also indicate lower interest payments as being a key part. One paper, Kawamoto and Muraki, also point out falling corporate tax rates. So we have some debate in the literature here. What I want to do is to look at what we know about Japan. Now, in Japan, it seems as if the pattern may be slightly different from the rest of the world. There's some debate in literature about whether or not the labor share in Japan systematically declined after 1980 or not. But there is broad agreement that corporate savings rose as a share of both corporate value added and in GDP in the 2000s. And you can see that in this chart, where these bars are showing you at the bottom here in blue, labor share from 1980 through to 2020, in fact, 2021. And you can see that there's no obvious trend in the labor share here. It seems to be bouncing around at about the same percentage share most of this period. It has ups and downs, cyclical ups and downs. But what you can see here is that the dividend share increases in the first part of the period and then decreases, and that the tax share is perhaps slightly decreasing. I beg your pardon, this orange bar is capital share, the dividend share is the yellow, which is increasing more in the 2000s. And the retained earnings part is up at the top here. So what the conclusions that we can broadly draw for Japan are that we have changes in dividend payouts after roundabout from the end of Japan's own banking crisis, late 1990s, when Japanese companies began to disintermediate, to change the way in which they finance themselves, to reduce their reliance on bank debt. If they were debt financed, they were doing more of it in other forms, equity, bonds, and so on. So that led to a change in the role of shareholders and to an increase in dividend payouts for a period. The major part of savings, though, has also come from lower interest payments because Japanese companies did major reductions in their general levels of debt as a result of the burst of the bubble. They repaired their balance sheets in a significant way. And so not only were interest rates going down, the amount of debt carried by Japanese companies was going down, so that their financial structure really changed to a significant degree, that more of their income was coming from property income. There was also a decline in corporate taxes in Japan that was quite steep during this period. So we can see some of that. I'm going to skip over that slide, but you can see the decline in corporate tax rates here in Japan. Now, Japan is still only down to 30%. So it's not as if Japanese tax rates have done what the UK has done, which is to reduce corporate tax rates to very low levels. These have come down to levels that are comparable to Germany, to France. The United States is still somewhat high, but you can see that there was a big change in Japan, and that's really what is relevant to the change in corporate savings that we're looking at. Okay, now I want to turn to the question of what companies do with their savings. Now, let me go back here and I'll just bring up that chart that explains what we're talking about. Okay, so far we've been talking about the fact that operating profits globally seem to be increasing, but possibly not so much in Japan. And that because these elements that are deducted in order to calculate gross savings have changed in Japan, we have rising gross savings in Japan. Now we're going to look at the question of what do companies do with their gross savings to give us net lending. That's what we're looking at next. Okay. So companies are now holding these savings and they have to figure out what to do with that money. Now, ideally, we want them to be investing that money in productive projects that increase national output. And the difference between savings and investment is what gives us net lending or net borrowing. And as I said right at the beginning, we've had a change in who are net lenders and who are net borrowers in the world. In the past, up to about 1990, Japan's corporate sector was a net borrower. That is, it invested more than it saved. And it borrowed the difference either from households via the banking sector or directly from households through capital markets by issuing equity and so on. That is no longer true. Companies now save more than they invest, and they are now net lenders. That is, they have surplus or excess savings. And you can see that in this chart, which shows you corporate savings at the top here in dark blue, corporate investment here, and this is investment in physical capital and equipment is what we're talking about. So building new buildings, building new factories, buying new machinery, that kind of investment. And the difference between the two is down here in the pink line, the corporate savings surplus. And what you can see is that there's been quite a significant shift since the start of the 21st century. And when we turn to looking at Japan in an international context, again, we can see that compared to peers, Japan still seems to be at the upper end of this corporate surplus. So this here is corporate savings, corporate investment, corporate surplus savings in Japan, in Germany, in the US, and the UK. This is an average for 2010 to 2019. Let me just go back one moment. Okay, so we've covered the points here that companies are now saving more than they invest. And what I want to show you is that this is a combination of two things. One is that the savings have increased. The other is that investment has really declined. So here we have a chart that shows you corporate gross capital formation as a percent of GDP. That's new investment in plant, equipment, factories, and so on for Japan since 1970. And you can see that there's a really significant decline in the level of investment in GDP up until 2010, up until the global financial crisis, after which it's sort of stabilized. But that brings Japan now down to very close to OECD members and well below East Asia. And many researchers would say that this is possibly now below optimal levels, although given that it's still higher than OECD members, that's a subject for another lecture. We can see this similar switch in G7 countries. So this is, again, a global phenomenon, this switch from the corporate sector being a net borrowing sector, as it was. This chart is from 1980 through to roughly the beginning of the 21st century, and then the corporate sector becoming, in general, a net lender. So global financial flows have really changed extremely dramatically since the 1990s is when the change really began, and by the 21st century, things look quite different. All right, I'm going to skip this. This gives you more detail in comparison to other countries, but this is focusing in on the picture for Japan, and again, just reinforcing the point that the household sector as a net lender is really shrinking away. The corporate sector in the blue is expanding as a net lender. The government is consistently a very big net borrower. Okay, now, why do we care about any of this? Well, and we'll come to this, I think, in the discussants' comments too, so we won't do too much of this now, but domestic savings investment balance is linked to the size of the international current account balance. That is how much Japan is earning from exports and investments abroad compared with its imports. I'll explain a little more shortly. It is also linked to how big the government deficit can be, because the private sector's net lending funds the government's net borrowing. As we've also seen, the size of corporate operating profits is related to the share of labor receives out of national income. And there are many reasons to be a bit concerned about that. And we believe that new fixed capital, new physical investment is related to innovation and productivity, and potentially to the existence of what have been called zombie firms, that is, firms who are sitting on resources and not doing very much. So there are a number of reasons why the way in which the corporate sector uses its savings and what the total savings and investment balance look like are important for the macroeconomy. Now, we can go into more details on how this all works, but I'm inclined to leave that and come back to it in questions. For the non-economists in the audience, this may be more than you want to know. The economists in the audience already know this, so let's just skip over it. But essentially, the message is that in an economy as a whole, the leakages out of an economy, that is how much is saved and not spent, have to be balanced by injections into the economy from some other source. And that can come as investment, or it can come as net exports, or it can come as government spending. But one way or the other, these things all balance each other out. So whatever happens in the private sector savings investment balance will be mirrored in one or other of those places. Okay. Now, this, I can't see the title of my slide here, but what do companies do with their excess savings? Okay, we've asked the question, what do they do with their savings? How much do they invest? What they don't invest becomes excess savings, and we want to know what they do with that. That becomes a financial surplus that the company will carry, and the company will then have to make a choice about how they're going to hold that net financial surplus that they've generated. That's a balance sheet question. They can either use it to improve their balance sheets by buying back shares, which reduces their liabilities, or by reducing their debt, paying back their bank loans, redeeming bonds if they've issued bonds, so that their balance sheet has less on the liability side, or the part they can, whatever they don't use to reduce their liabilities, they will be still holding as assets, and they can hold those as cash or liquid assets. So at last we get to the topic of today's lecture, that is cash hoarding. This is where cash hoarding comes from. So although it's taken us a while to get here, you can probably now see why I wanted to walk you through what it is we're really talking about when we refer to cash hoarding. And at the bottom of the slide, I just have a basic definitional equation that shows that gross savings can either be used for capital investment or for equity buybacks or for changes in net financial assets. Okay, now let's turn to look at what the data tells us about Japan. As far back as 1995, there was a famous paper by Rajan and Zingalis in which they noted, and I've highlighted the part that's relevant for today, that Japanese companies have a large amount of cash and short-term investments relative to companies in their peer group. So even as far back as 1995, commentators were pointing out that Japan seemed to be holding quite a lot of cash as a share of company assets. In 2022, figures compiled by the Ministry of Finance from company financial statements show that the business sector held 295 trillion yen in cash. That's a stock figure, that's from their balance sheets. Just to give you a sense of perspective, I never find trillions of yen a very easy number to get my mind around, but at an exchange rate of 150 yen to the dollar, just to choose a number at random, that is 197 trillion US dollars, which is, roughly speaking, the size of the GDP of Canada or Russia or South Korea or Australia. So the corporate sector in Japan has cash balances that are on the scale of the GDP of significant mid-sized countries. Now, again, Japan is not alone. So this turns out to be a global phenomenon. Most G7 countries' companies have increased their net financial holdings at the same time as they've increased their savings. So they've become corporate net lenders, and their physical investment hasn't kept pace with their savings. So they've also been accumulating financial assets. What we know for Japan is that they've used quite a lot of the first phase of that increase in savings to reduce debt. And then when the balance sheets were in a healthier state, less leveraged, they then continue to acquire new net financial assets. And that's a relatively recent share. So this graph shows you the Japan's corporate net savings here. So this is going from 1996 to 2020 and comparing cash holdings and savings in Japan with the US, UK, and Germany. So we have the net savings story, net savings here. We have the reduction in corporate leverage here, and that's for Japan. And we have the resulting usage of net savings down in this bottom panel. And here you can see that for the first part of this 2 decades that we're looking at, a decade and a half, the first half, what Japanese companies did was to pay down debt and to do a certain amount of equity buyback. And really the increase in their cash holdings began once this reduction in leverage had taken place. So the result is that Japan still has high cash holdings as a share of total assets. So the other element of this is, this shows you that their holdings, that Japan's holdings of cash as a share of GDP is relatively high in, no, this is not the right slide for that. Let me come back to that. It's the next one. Here's corporate cash holdings in Japan relative to other countries, now expressed as a percent of total corporate assets. And here you can see Japan, we might magnify this up. There's Japan, and you can see the scale is there. So that's Japan at about 15, little over 15% of total corporate assets being held as cash. Germany is closer to 12%. China is similar to Japan, and the United States is surprisingly similar to Japan. But Japan certainly is at the upper end of cash holdings. So the other point to note is that of listed companies in Japan, another way of getting a handle on international comparisons is to look at the number of companies that listed on the stock exchange who are net holders of cash rather than net debtors. And this chart shows you that of the companies listed on topics in Japan, over 50% are net cash holders compared to the percentages held in other major listings. So this is the Shenzhen listing in China. Here is Canada's stock exchange. Here's the S&P 1500 in the US, the CAC 40 in Paris, the FTSE All Shares in the UK, and a number of other exchanges. So it's not just that the average size of cash holdings is large, but that a majority of companies in Japan are holding cash. Okay, now let's turn to the question of why companies hold cash. Because what we're really asking, I posed the question whether companies are holding too much cash. So clearly having no cash is not an option. We need to think about why companies hold cash and how much it might be reasonable for them to hold. This is a very old question in economics. It goes back at least to Keynes, if not before. Well, in fact, before. But the modern way of thinking about this usually follows from Keynes in 1936. So in very simple theoretical terms, we think that companies should be holding just the amount of cash that equalizes the marginal cost with the marginal benefit of holding cash. The cost of holding cash is that it has a lower rate of return compared to other assets or to other uses of funds. And that's sometimes called a liquidity premium, but essentially cash is a low-paying asset. The benefit comes from a couple of different sources. One is usually referred to as transaction cost benefits. I'll define those in a minute. The second is the benefits of having cash available in case the companies need to use funds and can't get them from elsewhere. Now, in practice, those things are pretty hard to measure, but our sense is that firms routinely hold more cash than would just be dictated by equalizing the marginal cost and marginal benefit. But let's skip the next couple of points, just the final, at the bottom of this slide, I just wanted to use the terminology that we've mostly used since Keynes, which is we talk about transactions motives, which relates to the fact that having cash means that firms don't have to liquidate other assets, and there is a cost to liquidating any asset. So by holding cash, you avoid the actual transaction cost that's involved when you have to sell something for cash. Those are the transactions costs. The precautionary motive for holding cash is derived from the fact that firms may need to finance activities at short notice, or in any case, at times when it's difficult to access outside capital markets, or when the cost of accessing outside capital markets is high. And so firms hold cash as a precaution against not being able to find funds when they need them. In addition, we often see discussion in economics of agency theory, meaning that managers who are considered to be acting as agents on behalf of shareholders will often have a preference for holding more cash than the shareholder owners of the company would choose to hold. And that will be because having cash gives managers some discretion. It gives them some freedom and independence to go off and do projects without having to actually negotiate to get cash. So what's the empirical evidence that tells us something about whether the amount of cash that companies hold makes sense? Can we understand where it's coming from? Now, this is a huge literature, and I'm going to gallop through it in just a few minutes, but to give you a sense of it, what we typically find in these empirical studies is that firms that have strong growth opportunities, where they have projects that they could be investing in, firms that are in riskier industries, that is where their cash flow is perhaps very variable, firms that are small, firms that have higher intangible assets or high research and development expenditures, or have managers with ownership stakes, seem to hold more cash than other kinds of firms. On the other hand, firms that are large, that have good access to credit markets, for example, they might have a credit rating, firms that pay dividends hold lower amounts of cash. And those kinds of findings are consistent with the idea of transactionary motives and precautionary motives for holding cash. These represent the fact that firms that are going to have more difficulty accessing external financial markets are likely to hold more cash. Firms that have a better chance of being able to access outside capital when they need it will have less reason to hold cash and can maximize the return on their assets by not holding cash. I think the rest of the points on this slide are really just a repeat of those points. But it is worth noting that these precautionary motives, that is, holding cash for a rainy day, holding cash in case you might have a project that comes up and you can't access external financial markets, suggests that there are some imperfections in those financial markets themselves. So the fact that we observe that firms that face those bigger financial constraints suggests to us that the markets are not able to assess the value of those companies. They can't assess the sort of projects the companies want to do. If they're intangible assets like R&D, intellectual property, goodwill, the kinds of assets that service industries have, those are harder for lenders to value, and they don't provide collateral. So if lenders are looking for collateral, these kinds of projects don't give companies that opportunity, and so those companies likely hold more cash. But it is telling us that there is a problem in the financial markets about the amount of information that's available. Okay, there are other factors that seem to turn up in some of the empirical evidence about holding cash. Two particularly that I think are relevant to Japan. One is that idea of agency opportunities, that managers may prefer to hold cash because it gives them independence. Now, some of the literature links that to weak corporate governance because it allows managers to hoard cash to ensure their independence. But it has to be said that the empirical evidence for this is at the moment still pretty weak. So there have been attempts to look at whether companies with weak corporate governance or countries in which the corporate governance system is considered to be weak tend to hold more cash. And it's pretty difficult to see concrete, strong empirical evidence. So that's an ongoing research debate, clearly of relevance to Japan. A second issue that you often hear in informal discussion for Japan is the idea of general risk aversion. That is there a culture for wanting certainty? Are companies holding on to cash because they just like the feeling of having big cash pools? And again, the empirical evidence here is very unclear. I've only seen one study that tries to get a handle on this sort of cultural aspect, It compares firms in Europe with firms in Asia. And that author thinks that there are some results there, but I'd have to say that the evidence is pretty unclear. And in particular, you might ask yourself, if these factors are so large, how do we explain the fact that cash holdings change over time in response to changing economic circumstances within countries which have not seen any obvious change in culture or in risk attitudes? So if you just look even at Japan's own pattern, you can see pretty big changes. So you'd have to be asking yourself, how can these relate to the slow changing nature of culture and risk preference? And it's very hard to distinguish those elements from other institutional structures in these countries as well. So I'd say the jury is out on those. Let's turn now to Japan itself. And here I've got a rather terrible slide which is really should have been notes to myself about the various studies that I've looked at for Japan. But for those of you who are interested in having a description, they are here. What I conclude from this look, incomplete yet, but beginning look at studies for Japan, is that in general, the studies find that the same kinds of firm characteristics that we saw being important in the global studies are also important explanatory factors for Japan. So we do see that those firm characteristics matter. Small firms hold more cash than large firms. Firms that face borrowing constraints are more likely to hold cash than firms that have lower borrowing constraints. There are different ways of measuring that. It's firms in industries where the Tankan survey suggests that bank attitudes are tight compared to firms in industries that don't think that the bank attitudes are very tight. The former hold more cash than the latter. Firms with no main bank relationship seemed to hold more cash than others. Firms with intangible assets, that is, that are hard to value and don't provide collateral, seem to hold more cash than others. So in a number of ways, studies replicate for Japan the results that are found in other countries, that it's these firm characteristics that reflect transactions and precautionary motives are giving us a lot of the explanation for cash holdings. There are a few other things that come out for Japan, certainly in the last decade or two, which would suggest that a lack of confidence in growth prospects probably counts for a certain amount in Japan. But there isn't much direct evidence that there is an unusual degree of risk aversion. That is, the scale of these sort of explanations is fairly similar between Japan and other countries. One additional point that the Bank of Japan has noted is that deflationary expectations may have played a role. That is, cash holdings become more valuable if prices are falling. So the rate of return on cash goes up in deflationary periods and with deflationary expectations. Okay. Now, the final point I want to draw your attention to, though, is how do we know whether cash holdings are too high? So we've got an idea of why companies hold cash, but we don't have a benchmark. So the finance literature has tried to create a benchmark by doing an estimate of what would, using all of those standard company characteristics, you can estimate what would be a level of cash holding that we can explain. So that might give you, for what would be more accurately described as predicted levels of cash holding. And then you can compare that with actual levels of cash holding and back out a number that gives you an estimate of excess cash holding beyond what we can explain by transactions and precautionary measures and other features of the corporate sector, are companies holding more cash even than that? Now, so there was a well-known paper in 1999, which has been replicated for a number of countries as a way of getting a handle on this. And as far as I can see, there are very few studies like that for Japan. I did find one. There may well be others, but so far, what I have been able to deduce from that study is that, the same factors that drive cash holdings for this particular study just compares Japan and the US. So we go a long way by using the standard explanatory factors for cash holding. But the standard nature of Japanese cash holding is a more recent phenomenon. So those factors did a less good job of explaining cash holding before the 1990s. Since the 1990s, they're taking us a long way towards this, but it's still the case that they estimate that Japanese firms are holding a quite high proportion of their assets, and higher proportion of their assets as cash than equivalent US firms. And in their view, the firms that do hold a lot of excess cash tend to be poorer performing firms. Now, that's a fairly controversial finding. They link it to poor governance, although it could be connected to other aspects of poor management of these firms. And their policy recommendation is that improving governance would reduce excess cash and would improve performance. I would say that that's still a very tentative finding. It would need further research. And in particular, you can't ignore the fact that the biggest cash holders in Japan are household name listed companies. They're mostly large and successful companies. And in fact, Fukuda argues that we should think separately about small and medium and large companies. The large companies who hold a lot of cash are typically companies that have profitable opportunities but haven't been able to realize them yet. The small companies that hold cash may be a more mixed bag, but nonetheless, it's difficult to yet say that we understand who are the companies that hold really excess cash and what is the nature of their business. So let me summarize and hand over to my discussant. What I've been saying to you today there are a number of points. Japanese firms retain a high proportion of their earnings, that is, they save a lot. Since the global financial crisis, they've become net lenders, not net borrowers. That creates positive net private sector savings, despite the aging of the population. So we haven't yet seen Japan move into that reduction of savings phase that we expect. The existence of those net private sector savings enable financing of government debt, and they're matched by current account surpluses. But you have to ask yourself, what happens if it stops? So before people rush to say to companies, you've got to stop being net lenders, you have to think, who's going to fund government debt if that happens? And there have been a number of important papers pointing out that this is a knife edge problem. Those high shares of operating profits are matched by low, though stable, shares for labor out of net national income. We can't say anything about causality here, but it does mean that there might be margin for increase in labor payments. But again, if that reduces the corporate sector's net lending, then those financial buffers that have been financing government spending will be reduced. Out of those high net savings, a high proportion are being held as liquid assets, excess cash, and that probably reflects barriers to the better functioning of financial markets. That is, that financial markets are not able to assess companies' projects very efficiently. They are largely wedded to the use of collateral for lending, and intangible assets don't provide capital. So companies that want to invest in R&D and in newer industries are more likely to face restrictions on their lending. And those barriers in the financial sector increase the lack of confidence and increase the reasons that companies might have to hold cash. If we want to see greater investment in new industries and new types of physical capital and so on, it's not going to be enough just to address the way in which companies hold their assets. There will have to be other structural changes as well, and particularly changes to the way lenders assess new projects. We need a lot more research to better understand what drives excess cash holding and what behavioral effect it has on companies and what it's telling us about what companies are doing. And that's where I'll stop. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Corbett, for this fascinating, informative talk. Your perspective of viewing Japanese economic phenomenon situations within and beyond together at the same time is always valuable. And like our audience, I look forward to the following dialogue and discussions. So here now, we will hand over to Professor Nilay. He will be giving us some thoughts on this topic. Professor Nilay, the floor is yours.
Let me just stop here we are, stop share.
Yes.
Okay, thanks.
Am I sharing the slide again? Okay. So first of all, I'd like to thank Tokyo College for giving me this fascinating opportunity to discuss on the excellent lecture given by Professor Corbett. I will first start reviewing what we learned from this lecture, and then try to give some comments from my personal perspective. So it's clearly explained by Jenny that the Japanese corporate savings haven't risen. And to some extent, it is a global phenomenon. But in Japan, the corporate saving is much higher than the other countries. And then mainly, this high corporate savings is driven by high operating profits. And the investment, so that is the gross corporate savings, and the investment of firms does not amount to that the gross savings, and so that makes the Japanese firms in the net lending position. So that is the one secular trend of Japanese corporations that we should note. The second point is the cash holding of Japanese firms. And this is often highlighted in the international debates about the global saving glut by Bernanke and etc. Now, but that if we interpret that savings glut as the net lending or gross savings, that's true. That applies to Japan. But if we mean by the cash holding as the literally the cash holding as a portfolio of firms' wealth management, asset management, then the point gets a little bit disputable. It's not that the Japanese companies stand out in very high cash holding. It is certainly high, as Jenny explained to us, certainly high at the 15% of total asset of firms, but the US firms have the 14% cash. So it's certainly Japanese firms hold the cash ratio to the total asset at the high end across many other countries. It's not that it's standing out. Also, in the domestic debates, this high retained earnings is seen as kind of symptom of problems of Japanese companies. And sometimes we hear the proposal for the taxation of the retained earnings. There's some confusion in that debate. Certainly Japanese companies report high retained earnings, but it means that the lot of firms capital financing formation has been financed by retained earnings. It doesn't necessarily mean that cash firms are holding cash. So high retained earnings more mean that the firm's capital formation has not been financed by debts. So as Jenny explained, the Japanese firm's debt positions has reduced a lot. That's the meaning of high retained earnings. Now, the question is that whether all these high corporate savings and high retained earnings is the problem. Now, it could be a problem if these are the cause of smaller amount of private capital formation in Japan. Because if firms don't invest in Japanese production facilities, it will mean the less labor productivity of Japan and a smaller lower wages. Now, this small private capital formation could be a sign of a crowding out of the huge government spending. And then debate goes on that government has to spend because of weak domestic demand, etc. So I think that is the current state of the debate. So the left-hand side graph iterates on that point of high Japanese gross savings, or the savings minus investment, IS balance. So blue line is the Japanese savings, firm savings minus investment to the as a ratio to the GDP. So in the before the 1990s, Japanese firms are net borrowers. So they borrow a lot and invest a lot. And that is considered as a kind of natural functioning of firms, that they borrow and invest and produces the capital, private capital. And that changed during the 90s. Japanese firms started to reduce the debt, and they started to reduce the investment. So they're now in the net lending position, and that net lending position was particularly high in the early 2000s. Now, there was sometimes a downward episodes, like after 2005, up until the global financial crisis, the Japanese firms had started the investment, but then global financial crisis of 2008 reversed the trend. And then since then, the Japanese firms still maintain the positive net lending position. Now, as Jenny pointed out, this is also a global phenomenon, that the firms are no longer the net borrowing sectors. However, from the international comparison, this current Japanese firms' net lending position of 2% to 5% is higher than the other countries like Germany, UK, and US. So the debate has been focusing on this. So some pointed out that Japanese big corporations have lost the entrepreneurship. They stopped investing, and then they got inward, and they view this net lending position as the symptom of the lack of entrepreneurship of Japanese corporations. One proposal to deal with this Japanese corporate behavior was the reflation. So moving to the right hand side of the plot. So here on the right hand side graph, I'm showing the interest rate of long term. So this is a Japanese government bonds, 7-year bonds interest rate in the red line. It was quite high during the 80s and early 90s, but since then it declined a lot. Blue line is the inflation rate of a CPI. And as we all know, since the end of the 1990s, Japanese inflation is almost zero or mildly deflation. So that means that the real interest has been relatively high until the mid-2000s. So real interest rate is the nominal interest rate minus the inflation rate. So that is the gap between this red line and blue line. So in the high time of 80s, we had a high real interest rate. So the Japanese firms invest a lot, and that was rebated back to the households as the interest payment on their deposits that are borrowed by the firms and the invested. That changed after the burst of the bubble in the 1990s. So inflation rate goes down. The nominal interest rate is reduced as the policy measure to combat this stagnation of Japanese economy, but the speed is as fast as the inflation declining. So we see that this gap between red and blue line, the real interest rate, did not decline as fast as the nominal interest rate. The situation became a bit reversed just right before the 2008. So from 2005 to 2007, the real interest rate gets small. And then that might correspond to the left-hand side small net lending of Japan in that time period. But then the global financial crisis reverted the trend. And then in order to combat that, since 2013, there's a massive monetary ease that finally changed the trend. So after 2013, we see the inflation is on average above the nominal interest rate. So real interest rate finally got negative. So that was the effort in order to prepare the environment for the Japanese firms to invest more vigorously. Now the question is whether the Japanese corporations responded to that incentive. Left-hand side plot seems that they didn't. So that's where the criticism against Japanese corporations is raised, that maybe they have lacked entrepreneurship because they didn't invest even in the environment of low real interest rate. And I'm sympathetic to that view. However, there's one point that we can note. So in this plot, I'm showing the outlay of this net lending of firms' position from the flow of funds of Bank of Japan. Sorry for these Japanese plots, but then in the left-hand side plot, we see a components of asset acquisition of Japanese firms. And one item points out, that is the foreign direct investments. So foreign direct investments from 2005 on is always positive and it's increasing over time. So it's interesting. foreign direct investment is the investment, actual investment of a corporate sector, but it took place abroad, not within Japan. So in the firm's balance sheet, it is seen as the increase of the asset position. So we might think that in this time after 2010 or so, Japanese firms are not that they are not investing, but they are investing abroad, not within Japan. So if that is true, then the lack of entrepreneurship criticism against Japanese corporations might be misleading. And this overseas investment by corporate sectors helped and also changed Japanese economic status. So this is Japan's current account. So a blue line is Japanese current account since 1996, and we all know that Japanese current account is surplus. However, the composition of the current account has changed dramatically in these 20 years. So orange line is the trade balance. Trade balance was in the surplus before 2010, but then afterwards it sometimes gets negative, and these days it's no longer positive for sure. These days the trade balance is almost balanced. So Japanese economy has this image that we always run a trade surplus, but that has changed in these 10 years and 20 years. By the way, this big decrease of the trade balance around 2011 to 2015 is caused by the energy price increase. So this is a good reminder that Japan is still a big importer of fossil fuels, and the paying for that imported energy is a fundamental environment for Japanese economy. Now, trade balance is almost zero these days, but the current account is positive. So what is earning money from abroad? That is this gray line. This is primary income, and most of primary income is the corporate sector's profits from their facilities abroad. And we see a trend increase of this primary income. So this is the dividend the Japanese corporate sectors got from their foreign direct investments. And that almost amount to the Japanese current account these days. This primary income has helped Japanese income. So in this plot, a blue line is a GDP. And then the orange line is GDI, that is the gross domestic income. The difference between GDP and GDI is the trade gain or loss. So in the bottom line, I show the formula for real GDP. We see that the price of export and price of import is fixed when we compute the real GDP. But in reality, the price of export and price of import changes over time. In the case of Japan, for these 20 years, price of export declined a lot and price of import increased. That means that we run trade loss by the change of prices of exports and imports. GDI takes into account this trade loss. Therefore, GDI, the increase of GDI over these 20 years is much less than the increase of GDP. This is because Japan has been running a trade loss due to the changing pricing structure of export goods and import goods. If you look at GDI, Japanese economy is not growing a lot. However, there's a new source of income for the national income. That is the primary income that I showed in the previous slides. So corporate sectors invested a lot abroad as a foreign direct investment, and they gain profits out of it. We add this primary income to this GDI, that is the gross national income, GNI, that is the gray line. And if you see it, we can see a tangible benefits that the Japanese economy got from the foreign direct investment of corporate sectors. So I think this foreign direct investment of the corporate sector has been a rational move by the Japanese corporations. Because the Japanese currency was relatively high during this period. So this plot shows that the blue line is the Japan's effective exchange rate. So we see the yen has been strong in the 90s and 2000s, and recently it's got devaluated. So during the time of a high currency, the Japanese corporation have chosen to invest abroad. That might make sense. But then the thing is just changing these days, mainly due to the interest difference that Japanese yen got devaluated significantly. Another thing, one more thing I want to point out is the financing, overall financing in Japan. So Japanese corporations reduced lending from the banks. And in this plot, I show the fraction of the credit financed through the capital markets divided by entire finance of the corporation sectors. So Japan is the orange line. So we see that above 30% of their the corporate credit is financed through capital markets. So the rest, about 70%, is from the banks. So interestingly, the composition of banks lending for the Japanese firms' external financing has increased. And that is, the opposite from the trend of other countries. So overall, this means even though Japanese corporations try to reduce the debt from the loans from the banks, the size, the fraction of the bank borrowing is still large. That means that their external financing overall has been shrunk. And that corresponds to the rising role of retained earnings of their financing. Now, what does this point to the possible Japanese the problems in the Japanese economy? I see the Japanese firms investing abroad, foreign direct investment so far has a lot of rationality. It helps the national income, but one downside is that investments are done outside of the border. So the workers in Japan didn't benefit from that investments. So the challenge I think we face is how to attract domestic investment. So Japanese firms are not investing domestically. Some people said that, well, this is natural because the domestic demand is saturated. But still, we are aspiring for a better life. And also, we can engage in the global growth. In order to participate in the global growth, the Japanese firms have invested abroad so far. But they could have, and still they can invest within Japan, and then incorporate global innovation within Japan. That is possible, for example, by inviting Jenny CORBETT here and investing in this and let their knowledge shared among us, and then create something new within the border of Japan. That is the new investment that I think we need in Japan. Also, inbound FDI from the foreign corporate will be welcome And I would call it internal FDI, that is the Japanese corporation itself might do some kind of direct investment within Japan that would attract foreign productive factors such as human capital or new technology. And that type of investment will be important, especially when the yen come back in the near future. Also, there is things to mend about the financing because banking sector seems to not be able to lend to the profitable and growing sector. And the startup financing is still young in the nascent stage in Japan. Now here, the government strategy is to boost the from savings to investment policies and the let the citizens to participate in the direct financing of the firms by the equity holding, etc. Now, this might be a good move in the raising the Japanese citizens' sense of ownership toward the Japanese business and also the management. And I think this could be a good way to monitor Japanese firms' management that they're doing good investment in order to grow the economy. So this is all my comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for great comments. And I guess, let me just say a couple of things in response, and then we'll take a couple of questions from the floor. I just wanted to say that I think your perspective is really helpful because on the one hand, it reinforces some of what I was saying, but it also gives a much richer way of thinking about what we're really concerned with. You know, why are we focused on what companies are doing with their retained earnings? So I think I particularly liked your point about the fact that the way in which companies are now financing investment has changed. Well, it is now much more directly financed by retentions. I would say that actually back in the 1980s through to the 1990s, I worked on projects with colleagues at Oxford where we looked at how companies finance their investment. And we argued then that actually the share that came from retentions was much higher than was generally recognized, and that it's partly a matter of how you do the data and what share you take out of what as a way of measuring this. But our argument was that actually there were virtually no corporate sectors that were majority externally financed. So in some sense, this is something that is not necessarily new, but that it has been underappreciated for a long time, that actually retentions in the corporate sector can be really useful and important way of financing investment. There's always a risk that if there isn't enough external monitoring, that companies can do wasteful investment, but that's a separate problem. But there is a good deal of efficiency in actually having investment financed by insiders to the firm who understand exactly what the project actually is. And you don't have then that problem of trying to persuade your external financiers to understand your project. If they don't have the information, they can't monitor it accurately. It's not necessarily a bad outcome. So I think that is a really valuable point to add into this discussion. And I do also really appreciate the point that you've made about foreign direct investment, that actually if we focus exclusively on domestic fixed capital formation, we miss all of that activity that's going on. And that is not only valuable for the economy, but it is telling us something also about, the nature of corporate activity and the nature of the financial markets at home and so on, that is really important. It seems to me that what it does, though, is raise a question that we need to think about, which is that companies are becoming increasingly dependent on their property income as well as the income from their actual production. So that even just looking at the data that I was using, we could see that property income was becoming an increasing part. Once you also add in property income coming from foreign investments, this can, for some companies, become a really significant part of their income. And my question is really whether companies themselves understand that, and whether that in some cases may present management and boards of directors with a challenge that they're not, that they haven't thought about very well. And that may require, some training and education and so on, and certainly requires that valuations, stock market valuations, also need to take this into account. So that, I think, is a feature that all of this discussion highlights that is perhaps hasn't been as appreciated up till now. So there are a number of other really interesting points in here too. I think the way you've drawn attention to the change in the nature of Japan's trade balance is really important for policymakers too. So there's a lot happening here. Now, we have hardly any time left, and I'm going to pick up one question from the floor just to finish. We've got one question about price-to-book ratios and the role of activist investors. And the question basically is whether the role of activist investors is something that is going to be important, increasingly important. And I think that it relates to a couple of other questions that are in here too, which are about the nature of the financial market in Japan. And my reaction, but I'd like your reaction too, is to say, yes, look, I think actually the financial capital markets in Japan, financial markets are changing. Although we've identified that there are still some issues that need to be improved, we've seen enormous change in the way companies are financing themselves. So there already is a very big difference in the way companies are dealing with their shareholders and their other stakeholders and their capital partners. And that is going to continue to change. And it is, there will be ups and downs, but on the whole, it should also incorporate a role for activist investors, for those who are genuinely trying to be helpful and constructive. And I think that that's probably something that Japanese companies will not always avoid and dislike, that there are sometimes that can actually be useful for management to be challenged a bit and to come back even to their more conservative shareholders and say, we need to be thinking about new directions and so on. But I wonder what you think about that.
I'm generally positive for the activist participation. But also the financial market have broader opinions. So sometimes activists are criticized for their short-termism. Short-termism is something that Japanese corporations have avoided so far. So the view from the long-term investors should be important too. And I hope that the participations by broad citizens may bring in that other perspectives to the financial markets.
Yeah, and I think that also addresses one of the other questions here about the way in which capital markets will have to learn to assess intangible assets and to share information more effectively too. And I think at that point, we're basically out of time. So thanks very much.
Thank you once again, Professor Corbett and Professor Nie, for this wonderful discussion. And it's a pity that we do not have more time to address more questions, but I believe the conversations will carry on in one way or another. Finally, to our audience, thank you everyone for joining us today. And to receive latest news of Tokyo College research activities and our public events, you can check our websites or subscribe to our mail magazine or follow us on social media platforms. We hope to see you in our future events. Thank you.